to a Hope 1032 podcast.
As followers of Jesus, in whom all things were made, we acknowledge the Darug people as the traditional custodians of the country of where this podcast is recorded. We acknowledge their continuing connection to the land and waters and thank them for protecting this land and its ecosystems since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and we extend that respect to all First Nations peoples listening today.
Hope Book Club with Georgia Free. Because life's just better with a book.
Hi, I'm Georgia and welcome to episode 77 of the Hope Book Club podcast, where we chat about books from a hope-filled lens. I'd love for you to join our Facebook group. You can simply search for Hope Book Club on Facebook. We have over 500 members now, which is so exciting, and plenty of book-related chats on there. I am honoured today to be speaking to Australian bestselling author and journalist Diane Armstrong. Diane was a childhood Holocaust survivor who fled to Australia with her parents from Poland in 1948. She has since used her talent and love of words to write her family's story. Her family memoir, Mosaic, was actually shortlisted for the Victorian Premier's Literary Award and the National Biography Award. Her first novel, Winter Journey, was shortlisted for the 2006 Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and she has written a total of 6 novels and 2 non-fiction books since then. I'm so excited to be able to talk to her today about her latest, The Wild Date Palm. Diane, welcome to the podcast. I'm so thrilled to have you.
Oh, thank you, Georgia. It's great to be here and talking to you.
Now, I understand it's been a very busy few months, couple of weeks, especially promoting the book, Diane. And before we get into it, I would love to actually know just a little bit about your story. You are a childhood Holocaust survivor. Can you share a little bit about what your family went through?
Well, I was born in Poland just before the outbreak of World War II, which was not the most auspicious date to be born in. We were in Poland. The Germans occupied the western part of Poland very quickly. We were living in Krakow, where I was born. And a few months later, the Germans divided up Poland into 2 parts. And we went east because that was where the Russians were in power. And for a while, things were not too bad. The Russians just persecuted everybody equally. They didn't differentiate, so we weren't in more danger there than anyone else. But then in 1941, the Germans broke their pact with the Russians and they occupied the eastern part of Poland. And that's when things became very frightening for all the Jews that lived there. And by 1942, there were very few Jews left in that part of Poland, which is now Lviv. But it was then called Lvov. It was then part of Poland. We fled to a village where nobody knew us. That also had a problem because who went to a village where no one knew the priest, no one knew anybody there? It immediately put you in danger because the locals would then wonder why you were there. Luckily, my father, who was a dentist, became the village dentist. And even more lucky for us, there was a new priest in the village. And he was very fond of my parents and he loved playing chess with my father. So even though the local villagers kept coming to the priest saying these people must be Jewish, this is in spite of the fact that we used to go to church every Sunday and tried to hide our Jewish identity, of course. But still, rumors circulated that we were Jewish. It was really just the friendship of the priest that saved our lives because the priests had an incredible moral authority in the villages and nobody really wanted to go against him when he made it quite clear that he was our friend. And that saved our life. And that's why I, unlike 1.5 million other Jewish children, survived the Holocaust.
Wow, Diane. And then you fled essentially with your parents to Sydney in 1948.
That's right.
How much do you remember of this time?
Of the time in Poland during the Holocaust.
Yeah, or the time in Poland and the fleeing to Australia. Yeah.
Well, I don't remember much about our life in the village, but I do remember that there was one incident. I must have been maybe 4 years old, maybe, and I was playing in front of the house where we lived, and a man from the village stopped outside watching me, and after a while he said, "What's your name, little girl?" And I told him the name that we had changed to to sound less Jewish. And I told him that name, Danusha Bogusławska. And he said, yes, but what was your name before?
Wow.
And I apparently stamped my foot and I said, that's always been my name. And he went away. And actually, my father had been standing in front of the door, watching and listening to this frightening exchange, because our lives actually hinged on my answer. Luckily, I remembered what I was supposed to say, and he went away. So that was one memory that I have. I remember vaguely taking part in religious processions, scattering rose petals with the other children. I remember the end of the war. We went back to Krakow, and I remember one incident. This was in 1946, where there was shooting in the street and there was shouting. And I was walking with my mother, and she grabbed my hand, and we rushed into a nearby church. And she said, we're going to stay here till all this passes. And what was happening was a May Day parade, and there was a lot of anti-Semitic comments and shouts and threats. And I remember how frightened we were inside that church.
Wow. And so much that a child should not have to endure, but you did. Tell me about that transition into your life in Sydney, because your whole family, I understand, came without speaking pretty much a word of English, and you had to adapt.
Yes. You know, when I think back, I mean, I was 9 when we arrived in Sydney, and I couldn't speak a word of English, and they sent me to school, and I'm sitting there in the classroom and the teacher's talking. I've got no idea what she's saying. She's saying something and it all sounds like blah, blah, blah. And I've got no idea what's going on. And at some point she says, next. And a little boy stands up, because in those days, just shows you what a dinosaur I am. In those days, children used to stand up when they spoke to a teacher. So this little boy stands up and he says something. I don't know what he's saying, but I thought, well, his name must be Next. That's what I decided. So he sat down and there was more talk by the teacher. And then she says, next. And again, another little boy stood up. And I thought, this is a weird country. All the little boys are called Next. So the conversation went on. And the next time she said, next, luckily for me, a little girl stood up. And that's when I twigged that what the word really meant. And that's really the only concrete example I can remember of learning English. The rest of it just washed over me. I just picked it up.
Yeah, and when you're forced to, you had to adapt quite quickly.
Yes.
Diane, where did your love of writing begin?
Well, when I was 7 years old, my mother told me, or she told me that when I was 7 years old, I said to her, when I grow up, I want to be a writer. And I think that's partly because I'm an only child. There was no TV. There were no smartphones. There was no television. So I used to read a lot. And I had a vivid imagination even then. As soon as I could speak English, I started reading English books. My favorite was Enid Blyton. I love the detective stories, and I was dying to find a mystery to solve. And sadly, there weren't any. But one day I noticed that there was one girl in the classroom who was talking in a very aggressive way to another girl. And I put 2 and 2 together and got 10. And I decided that this girl was bullying the other girl, who was obviously in danger of being kidnapped. I mean, that's how my mind worked. So
the extremes, Diane, the extremes.
Yes. So I thought, well, I've got to do something about this. I couldn't just pretend I didn't know. I had to save this other girl. What would an Enid Blyton heroine do? So what I did, I wrote a letter to the headmistress in which I wrote to say that I was sorry to say that there was a girl in my class who was in danger of being kidnapped, and I was very worried about her. I posted it to the headmistress, and I waited. And 2 days later, I got a message in class, please go and see the headmistress. Well, I knew what this was about. So I went in. I still remember the headmistress's name. It was a Miss Child. She had lovely white hair and pink cheeks. And she said, "Now, Diane, what's this deep and dark mystery all about?" And I said, "Well, I told her that this girl was in mortal danger. She was about to be kidnapped by this other girl." And to her credit, Miss Child didn't laugh at me. She just listened very attentively. And when I'd finished, she said, "Well, thank you very much for bringing this to my attention. And please don't worry about it anymore. I will look into it and I'll take care of it." And that was the end of it. So that was my first exercise in fiction, but I didn't think it was fiction. The first story I ever wrote, a few years later, I called The Scorpion, and it was a melodramatic story about a girl who applies for a job and she meets a guy that helps her get the job. And I still remember the last line in my story, which said, she got the job, but she lost the man. I think I was 11 at the time.
Oh, my goodness me. Wise beyond your years.
I know. And I sent it off to the only magazine that it was all handwritten in my childish handwriting. And I sent it off to the only magazine I knew, the Australian Women's Weekly. And I waited with bated breath. But sadly, a few weeks later, the story was returned. And I never told anyone. I was so mortified that I'd had a rejection that I didn't even tell my best friend. I didn't tell anyone. So that was my first foray into writing.
Oh, my goodness me. But I think that's a good lesson to learn at such a young age, because I feel like if you don't learn rejection early, especially as a writer, it can be harder to learn later in life.
Well, I guess that's true. But ironically enough, the first article that I had published was published by the Australian Women's Weekly.
Redemption. There you go.
Yes. And I told people knew about that one.
Brilliant. And look, you've had a long, illustrious career. You've been a journalist. You've written your family's memoir. I'd love to talk, though, about this latest book, The Wild Date Palm, which is set actually against the backdrop of World War I rather than World War II, which a lot of your other novels are set against. Where did the inspiration for this particular book come from?
Well, most of the inspiration for my other books comes from something in the footnotes of history. I've always loved history and I just love researching it. And I love true stories as well, even though I'm a fiction writer. So most of my books are based on someone or something that's happened. With The Wild Date Palm, I was on a tour of Israel some years ago, and we're driving around. And at one point, the guide just points casually out of the window and she says, "Oh, that pretty little township among the vineyards, the amazing Aronson family lived there, and their young people in that family formed a spy ring, and they spied on the Turks in the First World War." So I sat up very straight and I thought, that sounds very interesting. I have to know more about this. So as soon as I got home, I did what we all do when we want more information. I Googled. And what I found out about this amazing Aronson family exceeded all my wildest hopes, because it was an incredible story. And I started to research it. And the more I delved into it, it was like falling into a rabbit hole. I researched more and more, found out more and more, and I just knew this was a story that demanded to be told.
For someone who hasn't read the book, how would you describe it in a few sentences, if you could?
It's a story about an incredible young woman who found amazing strength and courage in herself to do what really should have been impossible. My heroine, whom I've called Shoshana, she lives in a farming family. She feels that her life has no purpose, and she envies her older brother, who's a brilliant academic, a botanist, world famous, and she feels, how can I make my life count? All I do is copy French fashions and sew clothes for myself and my sister. one day she's on a train across the Anatolian plateau in Turkey, and she sees a horrific sight. Turkish soldiers driving thousands upon thousands of defenseless, unarmed people, mothers with small children. And she can't understand what's going on. She doesn't know that what she's just witnessed was part of the Armenian genocide. And what really stays even more in her mind is the fact that these soldiers don't bother hiding the evidence of what they've done. In other words, they don't have to answer to anybody for what they've done. And that makes her think of the repression of the Jewish communities in what was then Ottoman Palestine. She lives in one of these communities, and there's been increased persecution of the Jewish people in those communities. They've been deported, their goods have been confiscated, and it suddenly dawns on her that now it's the turn of the Armenians, but when they finish with the Armenians, the Jewish communities will be next. And that's when she finds her mission in life. She's going to form a spy ring, and she's going to find some like-minded co-conspirators, and they're going to spy on the Turks and pass on the information to the British, because she's decided that they really need the British to win the war. This is World War One. And she sets about doing it knowing she is endangering her life every minute of the day. She overcomes her fear and she persists in what she's doing, because this is now her mission in life. She's going to save her community.
Yeah, it's a brilliant book. I think it explores every aspect of humanity so well. And as you said, it is based on a true story. I'd love to talk about that a bit more, because you said that you love true stories, you love basing your books on true stories. When you are fictionalizing a true story, what liberties can you take and what lines can't you cross? Do you have kind of formulas?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, first of all, facts and history can't be fiddled with. Like the dates, the times, the places that, for instance, I've got the Anzacs near Beersheba. They're about to fight the battle that helps to defeat the Turks at Beersheba. All these things are true. And obviously, I'm going to have them as they were. What I can fictionalize are relationships, conflicts between people. For instance, in the story, there's an Australian guy who is part of the Australian Light Horse, and his name is Jack, and he's a fictional character, but he fulfills a role in the story. I keep to the facts of the story, but while we're on the subject of truth versus fiction in stories, it's like a paradox, because they say truth is stranger than fiction, and it is very often the case. Well, I'm writing about these incredible people and what they did, and I'm thinking while I'm writing, people are likely to think this could never happen. If it was in a factual story, it's different, but fiction has to somehow be more realistic than fact, which sounds like a paradox, but it's actually true, because I have to try and make what is basically unbelievable, believable for the reader. And I do this by making it more personal. So many people who've read this have said to me, they can't believe that all this really happened. But that's the challenge, to make fiction believable when it's based on something that isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, you said earlier, and also I was reading an interview that you did, that you said you always find your subjects in the footnotes of history, which I just love. And also in the extremes of human behavior. I feel like that's probably why you set a lot of your books, in wartime. I feel like we see the extremes of human behavior in both good and bad ways in these times. Why do you gravitate towards these stories?
Because I'm fascinated by what gives people the courage to risk their lives in pursuit of their ideals. And I think war brings out the best and the worst in human nature. And that's what fascinates me. What I'm interested in is really the grey area, not the black and the white, but the grey, the ambiguity of life, the part where maybe this or maybe that. In The Collaborator, that was a very good example of that. I had a guy who saved the lives of over 1,500 people. But he did that by negotiating with the Nazis. So he was later accused of being a collaborator. Well, was he a collaborator or wasn't he? And can we actually judge the past in hindsight? Do we have the right to make a judgment about situations where we were not there? So we can't really tell, and we shouldn't really, because the people that lived at that time were living under different pressures than we are. I would like to think that in my books, I shed some light on our human condition, on our common humanity, the good and the bad.
You absolutely do. And I'm sure you didn't mean for this, but obviously you've written this book in a time where Israel and Palestine are in the headlines, going through a great deal of conflict. And obviously you've written it in a different context, but still the same kind of geographical region. Do you believe that your novel has a kind of place in that discourse, in providing context, even of, historical events?
Well, I think it does have a place. I think it does provide a context for what happened before and what happened later. As one of the characters in The Wild Date Palm said, wars never end. They just cause other wars. And I think my book is, in a way, an illumination of that.
What do you hope readers feel, Diane, when they read this book?
Well, I hope that they're fascinated by the character of Shoshana, this incredibly strong woman who surprises herself by finding this strength in herself. Maybe we go away from that thinking, I wonder what I would do in that situation. I would hope that people would come away with more understanding of the conflicts during World War I, of the history of what became Israel. I didn't write it with that in mind, but as I wrote, I could see that was unraveling, that this was the beginning. This is how it started. And, I just hope that they are fascinated by the actual story. Look, I'm mindful when I'm writing that I'm not writing a history book. So fascinated as I am by history, I'm very mindful as I'm writing that I'm not giving a history lesson. I would hate to do that. That's peripheral to the story. It illuminates the story, but it isn't the story. So I try and keep that to a minimum.
Yeah, it is a fantastic book. Congratulations, Diane. And I ask this at the end of every interview. I'd love to get some book recommendations from you and what you've been enjoying recently. Have you, what books have you been enjoying so far, perhaps this year?
Well, the last book I've read, which I finished last night, is called The Postcard. And that's a French book. The author's called Anne Berest. And it's a family story of a very unusual kind set in France. I found it absolutely gripping and moving and beautifully written. And that's the last book that I've read, and I would heartily recommend it.
Fantastic. And what is next for you, Diane? Do you have another book on the cards? And you must hate it when people ask you that, like literally weeks after putting out a novel.
I don't hate it, but I often think it's really like asking a woman who's just given birth to a baby to say, well, when's the next one?
It's true. That's true.
But I do have an idea for the next one. But my head is still full of The Wild Date Palm, and I'm still very involved with it. So that's my baby at the moment. So I'm not really ready to start the new one yet, but I will.
Well, you enjoy the celebration of this book and enjoy some well-deserved rest as well. Diane Armstrong, it has been an absolute pleasure. The Wild Date Palm is out now wherever you get your books. Thank you so much for being on Hope Book Club.
Thank you, Georgia. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
As I said, The Wild Date Palm is out now wherever you get your books. And for more of Diane's work, you can visit her website at dianearmstrong.com, and that information is in the show notes. Make sure you join us over on Facebook at Hope Book Club for more updates, book recommendations, and great discussions. We'd also love this podcast to reach more people, and the way you can help with that is to rate, review, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and also share this conversation with a friend that you think might like it. Until then, stay reading. Here's a quote for your week. This one is from Diane's family memoir, Mosaic. Everything in the world is interconnected. Everything moves and changes, but nothing ever vanishes. Catch you next time.